The two options on the table are military. So the idea that a military offensive led by the Congolese government with support perhaps from regional countries could stop the M23. That doesn't seem likely at the moment. The Congolese government is pumping a lot of weapons and ammunition. They're engaging in sometimes dubious tactics by creating alliances with local militia. They're throwing a lot at this. And yet, despite all of that, there seems to be very little progress. Quite to the contrary, actually, the M23 has made many advances in recent months on the ground. So it doesn't seem that the military option is what's going to bring this to an end. On the other hand, if you look at the history of this region and at the previous armed groups, the predecessors to the M23, in 2013, the M23, there was another M23 uprising. In 2008, there was a predecessor to the M23, the CNDP. What brought an end to those insurrections? Well, every time it was foreign pressure, and in particular, it was pressure on the Rwandan government by the donors to the Rwandan government, since the Rwandan government, at least then, was found to be backing the M23. And so I think this time, the most likely scenario is that, at least initially, diplomatic pressure will be brought to bear on the Rwandan government, the M23, and that has the highest likelihood of bringing an end to this escalation.
But clearly, Jason, there's so many rebel groups operating in DRC. Why the scramble for Congo? And do you think the international community is paying enough attention to stop these atrocities?
Well, you're very right to highlight that there are 120 different armed groups in the eastern DRC. A lot of talk, obviously, about the M23, but the M23 is not the deadliest by far, actually, not the deadliest armed group in the DRC. There are others that hold that title. And so the priority now is to bring an end to this particular escalation that's displaced over 200,000 people and really brought consumes all of the oxygen in the room when you're talking about the peace process, the demobilization process in the Congo. So that's the priority, but that's not the end game. I mean, even before the M23 arose, there were over 5 million people displaced in the Eastern Congo. And so I think that the important thing to realize is that there is a much broader question of peace and stability. Something wasn't working even before the M23 broke out. We didn't care about it then. There's a little bit of attention focused on that now, but there's a bigger, broader problem.
So Kenya's current president, William Ruto, and former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta have called for cessation of these hostilities. And of course, the East Africa regional forces are on the ground in DRC. But do these mediation efforts go far enough? And what can be done to stop the atrocities that are still ongoing?
Well, I think it's great that the Kenyan government's involved. I think regional mediation is a very, very important factor in this. The Kenyan government has a lot of influence in the region, including over Uganda and Rwanda that have been spoilers in this conflict. And so I think the involvement per se, they also have a lot of business interests. Kenyans are getting increasingly involved in Congolese business, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So there's a lot of potential, and yet I think not much has come of it so far. Just today, the most recent peace talks in Nairobi were brought to an end, and there were basically no conclusions from this round of peace talks. And so I think there's been very little headway so far by this regional mediation. Now, in Luanda recently, there was a meeting of heads of states from the region where they concluded that if the M23 does not withdraw to the very edge of the DRC, to the positions that it held many months ago, then the East African force will basically wage war against the M23. And so I think the next step is to see whether they will carry out that promise, whether the East African Intervention Force will actually carry out offensive operations.
What's the impact of this chaos on civilians and DRC in general?
I mean, it's really heart-wrenching. There are 5.5 million people displaced in the DRC at the moment. That's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world outside of Ukraine and Syria. And yet we hear almost nothing about the DRC. The displacement in the DRC, when you hear displacement, it's a technical term, but what it means is that millions of people don't have a place to sleep. They don't have a reliable source of food or water or medical care. That's how people die. And that's traditionally how people have died in the DRC. It's not from machine guns or machetes. It's been through just petty displacement. And so It's had a terrible, terrible impact. It's also prevented the Congolese government from carrying out many of the reforms necessary. It's distracted attention. It's sucked up resources. And so it's a really tragic, and this is more displacement than has ever been in the DRC. We've been in conflict now in the DRC since at least 1996. And this is the highest level of displacement we've ever seen.
Jason, thank you so much for your insight into the crisis that is ongoing in the Democratic Republic of Congo.